inspiration should be a byproduct, not a directly aimed goal. Now, I'm going to say more about these things later on my next session. But to anticipate that, I would say this, that inspiration vis-a-vis students happens because of a personal flavor. Now, in your case, you have a particular problem, which I had to battle because I share the same domain as you do, academic domain, which is English literature. The problem with the teaching or learning of English literature is that it is an alien language and an alien literature. So that our students, particularly students whose level of English, shall be the sensitive understanding of the English language is limited. And it is limited. And I can prove to you convincingly. Is not able to enter into the experiential quality of the subject, of the text that he is or she is supposed to learn. You understand? So, see, excitement arises out of intimacy. Intimacy means the overcoming or the eradication of distance. This can be understood in relationships, for example. You can't be excited about a stranger. You can't say, oh, I don't know him, but oh, how wonderful. You can't say that. It's absurd. Makes no sense. So, but as you come closer to that person, he or she, you can say, oh, what a marvelous person. It comes out of intimacy. It comes out of being one, right? Or togetherness. So, this intimate knowledge of literature is not possible, or at least it is not easy, for a student in our context. The cultural barriers are far too opaque. The linguistic barriers are actually formidable. And as a teacher of literature, I was continually aware of the fact that at least about 90% of our students are not able to understand the emotional dimensions of words. Take any word for that matter. Now, every word has a history, not just chronological history, experiential history. And depending on how you grow, and I experienced it for myself, over the years I realized that how I experienced a particular word changed over the years corresponding to my personal growth and the expansion of my imagination. Right? So that the kind of excitement I now feel about text, I did not feel 30 years ago. I was a teacher then. Yes? So we have to grow in this process. Now, the best teacher is one who becomes the subject. Now, if I am just sort of handling certain quantities of certain textual quantities, and particularly in a mechanical fashion, I cannot inspire anyone. I'll only oppress people. Because I am subliminally, that is beneath my consciousness, I am experiencing it as a burden. You understand? I may be going into the class thinking that, oh, I have to teach this text. But I do so because I have no option. I have to. That's very different from walking into the class as the text. And at a certain point in my life, I stopped taking text to the class. Frankly, I knew the text by heart. I mean, I taught Shakespearean tragedy most of my life, because other texts also. I could go into a classroom without a text and teach it. And it became a very different experience. Understand? Now, I don't know if I inspired my students or not, but one thing I can tell you, every student of mine, later times, whenever he or she met me, has said one thing to me, and that is, said, sir, you taught like one possessed. That's the word everyone used. You taught like one possessed. Now, I was not even aware of it. But the point is this, I never taught any of my students keeping the examination in mind. Because I was very clear that, first of all, none of these books was written to be taught. literature was never produced, or even philosophy, any subject for that matter, nothing is ever produced to be taught, and particularly literature. Unfortunately, we have to use those texts which were not meant to be taught in order to teach. And then we have this added problem of a cultural linguistic barrier. But I don't want to discourage you. What I'm saying is, when you feel that, first of all, I want to salute you for your awareness that in spite of your eagerness to inspire your students, which is a measure of your love for them, which is commendable, eminently commendable, but in spite of that, you have not reached there. I would say that that's a very positive thing. The worst thing that can happen to a teacher is smugness, complacency. Thank God you are not infected with it. You understand? It's a deadly disease, this complacency. By the way, forgive me for saying this. I have dealt with various professional groups in my life, from teachers to politicians. For more than 12 years, I ran a program in Delhi. I'm also a priest, as you know. It was called Ministry to Parliamentarians. And I've interacted extensively with political leaders of all ranks and kinds. I ran a program for doctors in this country, for bureaucrats, for journalists, for priests, for teachers. And my experience is this: the most difficult people to teach are priests. Then next to priests, the most difficult are teachers. Because both are in the habit of teaching others. There's no exaggeration. I've always found the best group to work with are doctors. The very best. And I found politicians really good. They're open, they're keen. But they always say, look, we agree with all of you, but when we go back, it's the party whip that prevails. So there are two images in my mind with whips. One is politicians and the other is, you remember the bullock cart with which I began? And the bullock cart driver also had the whip, and the bullocks moved accordingly. So one is called the bullock and the other is called politician. This is not something that should discourage you. It's possible to overcome this, and I think, I can't give you sort of step by step analysis and tactics and technologies, but I can tell you that the most important factor here is becoming the text. You should become the speaking text in the classroom, but that by itself is not enough. You have to have that imaginative identification with the student, so that this text is connected to the student in his or her particular situation. And then one can use, once you know those limitations, then one will become creative. And by the way, creativity involves overcoming of hindrances. You know, an artist is always dealing with hindrances. Every medium offers its own resistance. Nothing in the world can be achieved without facing and overcoming resistance. Okay? Just as you can't walk without facing resistance. That's why you can't walk on a block of ice. Why? Because there is no resistance. So, the moment you are aware of problems or difficulties or various modes of resistance, then your creativity begins, and it sort of enables you to improvise various contextually effective or relevant methods to overcome those differences. For example, I used to ask my students to read a particular scene and then to come and address the class. Then I used to I'll ask them to form small groups among themselves. I said, you sit and discuss. What is it that you have learned from this scene? Okay? What does this character mean to you? what does this kind of network of imagery mean to you, and why does Shakespeare use it, and so on and so forth, all kinds of things, right? Then I would also ask them to relate a text to the present context. Now take any Shakespearean play, it's amazing how directly it connects to our times. Okay? So all a variety of things, and then concurrently also work with their language. We must help our students to improve their language. The level of language in this country is really appalling. You see, the convent school students speak English very glibly. It doesn't mean that they understand the language. We mistake this physical felicity with the use of words and language with an understanding of it. What I call the inward sense of a language. The inward sense of a language, which is very different from what it appears to be. Okay? So, but some of these difficulties are actually peculiar to the teaching of English literature in the Indian context. Right? Other subjects will have their own problem. For example, in mathematics, the problem is that as a teacher of mathematics as well as students, both are dealing with abstractions, absolute abstractions. And it's not given to every person to master abstractions. So how does a teacher then enable a student of mathematics to cope with that difficulty? And there, of course, I know that there's a limit to which you can go. If it is not there at all in somebody, then I would say that mathematics is not that person's field, and that such a student must be counseled to change the subject. That freedom, that flexibility is not in our system, unfortunately, but I think it's a tragedy to expect a child to persevere with the study of a subject with which one is not comfortable or one is happy. It's very important to have that sense of kinship with the subject. Possibly this is a hangover of colonial domination, which is deeply ingrained in our psyche, the impression, quite fallacious actually, that the white man is somehow incomparably superior. It's a myth. It surely is a myth. But because of the global cultural domination of the West and the incomparable opportunities, resources they have to brainwash the rest of the world into believing that their superiority is something willed by destiny and it's unshakable. And therefore, correspondingly also, the best that the rest of the world can do is to imbibe the white man's culture. And the most important duty the white man has is to go around spreading his culture, which was referred to in the 19th and 20th century as the white man's burden. You're familiar with this? Both students of literature and history know this, the white man's burden. Because of these various things, and of course then the other factor, as Karl Marx would argue, is the dominance of technology. The Western culture is equated with technology. Right, and technological superiority gives to the West almost impregnable security against other cultures, and the Asian cultures, particularly the Chinese and Japanese cultures, to some extent Korean culture, they have now learned to fight back the Western domination by mastering their own technology. You understand? So now, given this, keep that at the back of your mind. This reduced not only India, but about say 75% of world's population to a stage of abject imitation and conformity to the West. Now, this was also officially promoted by Western societies, particularly the United States of America, through offering scholarships, etc., to Indian quote-unquote elite to be educated in the best of their institutions. This was not humanitarian or philanthropic work, which was misunderstood. Their idea was very simple, to influence the elite in every society, because they knew, sociologically it is correct, that a society is shaped by its elite. Therefore, if you can influence the elite of India, the elite of Afro-Asia for that matter, then culturally these societies can be conquered, and they have done it. It's not, and of course, this was certainly taken to its perfection by globalization, which is not an economic project primarily, it's a cultural project. So let it be. Now, let me come to the education part of it. What is education at the macro level, at the larger level? Now, every thinker on education has said this, that education is the process by which as a people, a society, over generations develop and articulate its own genius. You understand? The idea of education is not that you become more employable in the market, which may happen. It must happen, there is no doubt about it. But that's not the prime purpose of education. A society educates itself. How many of you are familiar with John Dewey? Democracy and Education, Religious Principles in Education. You must read 2011, I think, came out this very important work. If you are familiar with the Kothari Commission report of 1964, the entire commission is influenced by John Dewey's book, Democracy and Education. It's worth reading. Anyway, let me come to this. So, education therefore must become unapologetically indigenous in its spirit, because it is the self-awareness and the self-expression of a people.